Hello. We're back on Hobby Think Tank where I'm going to start the music and the song
That's twice in a row. You forgot that.
every time. You know what? I just like you so much.
Oh,
Uh,
man.
Here we
Me on the
go.
other side.
See, I wanted to go live, and we are live.
Are we?
We are. John
Okay.
Keating, Danny Black, Hobby Think Tank, episode 438. How are you, sir?
Good, man. We don't look a day over 4:35, so it's good to be here, wherever I am.
Sponsored by Heckingers, Blockbuster.
Gimbals.
Actually, there's a website that does T-shirts of old places in each city. And I
Yep.
wanted to show you some of the Baltimore ones because I
Baltimore.
think Balmer, huh?
All right.
Um,
Well, Natty Bo never went away, right? People been putting that on T-shirts.
Natty Bo and the Utz Girl are an item.
Okay. Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, so that's just a little gossip. Uh,
What's up?
we have a chat room, and you posted a great question. And the whole point of this show is to answer questions in the hobby. And your question was, would who have more popularity if what?
Would Stan Musial have more hobby popularity or even greater popularity in general if he had been uh, featured on cards more? I know for some odd reason, Stan Musial shied away from tops for many years, and also, I guess, Bowman for a bit as well, for whatever reasons, even though he was on some Bowman cards. So, curious about that. I mean, there's an influence that these chaps had on young, mostly males back in the 50s. And I'm wondering if he missed an opportunity to capitalize on that for holding out for whatever reasons. He's on a 49, a 52, and a 53 Bowman.
Can I give a shout out to the book Bubblegum Wars? If you've never read it, read it. Great book. Ted Williams.
Yeah, Ted's an interesting story as well because Ted, same thing, but he jumped back and forth between Bowman and Tops except for 53, which is a crying shame because they're both incredible sets, until he capped it all off with his own dang set, which is pretty epic for back in the 1950s, I would think.
It was a baller move.
The regret there is no 1960 set, but I think there's the difference I see in these two guys is, well, I mean, we most of us think to this day, or many of us think to this day, that Ted Williams is the greatest hitter ever, right? So
I was going to say I think there's a little underrated there too.
And he was one of the biggest jerks, at least to the media, right? And to Mike Jugwax Hero as well, apparently. So get over that, dude. There's a therapist out there that has a lot of free time on his hands. Yeah, there's a therapist out there that now has a lot of free time on his hand. Mike from Maine. If you need him, look him up. I think he's in Connecticut somewhere.
I believe he works only with NFL quarterbacks. But,
yeah. So anyway, here we are. Ted Williams, cantankerous, love him, all that stuff. Stan Musial, by many, obviously a great player, but by all metrics, a wonderful human being as well, and a great harmonica player. So
he's in the Harmonica Hall of Fame.
Is that in Omaha, Nebraska, or is that just the Polka Hall of Fame?
That might be polka. I'd have to look up the harmonica. You got me there.
What do you call perfect pitch when a harmonica doesn't hit the side of the dumpster when you're throwing it in? Anyway, so hey,
there's a mini bar at the hotel, by the way.
There sure is. Oh man, my train of thought. Like, why? But why would Stan Musial, great guy,
Okay.
decide not to put himself. And then later on in life, he signed everything. He's still signing, as some have speculated. He's still signing, even though he's been dead for a bit. Why would he? What was the impetus to not get on board with these bubblegum companies? How harmless is bubblegum, for crying out loud? It's not like tobacco, right? And he's
W-
probably on a tobacco card, right?
Well, let's talk about, as much as he's a great guy, was there still a financial side to it?
Yeah, but if we're talking like the legend of all that stuff is we're talking about a free toaster, or a free set of encyclopedias. Is that worth bucking the system or bucking the trend? Uh,
Uh, or was it more of a humble thing? He didn't need his own card.
well, he started out that way, right? He started out strong with Bowman and I think Leaf, right? But just stopped. Stopped. He. What years did he not have Bowman cards? Was it 51 and 52 and 54 and 55?
But why do collectors not like him more?
Well, think about it.
That's
You're a kid.
that's what you're
You're
asking.
yeah. I'm sorry. I went way off. You're a kid and you're collecting cards, and if you can't relate to a picture that you don't, or if you don't have a picture to relate to, if you're in Oklahoma or California, a nice product placement, Georgia, whatever, that doesn't have their own team at the time. You're looking for somebody to be your hero. And if he's not in the cards and he's not regularly in the cards and your buddies aren't talking about him either, um, uh, you know, then that's a missed opportunity, in my opinion.
This might be a chicken and egg question, but would you say the amount of different cards that have been printed over um, time, so up till modern variations and inserts and all that stuff, do you think they print the players that are more popular, or the players more popular that have more cards printed? Does that make sense?
I don't know if it makes sense or if I'm reading that. It probably makes sense, but I probably don't get it. But there's plenty of players that aren't popular in every baseball card set, right?
Well, I was just saying, like Sandy Koufax, pretty
Hmm.
quiet, pretty reserved guy. I would assume that the money doesn't entice him if he doesn't want to sign a card contract. Then he's not going to sign it.
Right.
There's only been 4,700 roughly different Koufax cards ever made. Mike
Most of them were
Trout,
made within the last 30 years, right?
absolutely. Mike Trout, 23,000 separate cards.
Right. Right.
Stan Musial, only 8,000, and that includes. So he's closer to Koufax.
Right.
I mean,
Well, you're talking ice cubes versus glaciers, right? Mike Trout's an ice cube, possibly a snow cone. These guys are glaciers. They're not going away. Musial, Williams, Koufax. Their history has been written. Trout, is more than an ice cube, but a lot of what we're seeing now is, most of the players that are pumped by either collectors or dealers or whomever, they're ice cubes. They'll melt away. They'll never have an impact on the hobby again.
Mantle.
So,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, go ahead, man. You're good.
I was going to say Mantle's like double Musial in cards produced, and this is with all Mickey Mantle, one of the greatest players of all time. But is he disproportionately loved in the hobby? And is that because of the 52 tops?
No, it
I
has
mean,
nothing to do with the 52 tops because the 52 tops is just part of the story. It doesn't define him out in the wild there. Okay,
so
Mickey
why is he
Mantle's
loved so much more than
because
guys
he's
who are
the
just as
perfect
good?
perfect. He was Stan Musial was a better baseball player, had a better career than Mickey Mantle. Ted Williams had a better career than Mickey Mantle.
Agreed.
Mickey Mantle was a blonde haired kid in New York City, which was the epicenter of baseball for many decades. Right, he didn't create New York City as an epicenter, but he followed the lineage of Ruth and Gehrig and DiMaggio, and then there was Mantle. Right, so one of the problems is I think most people will agree that Willie Mays is maybe the greatest baseball player of all time. Okay.
Yep.
Um, and I see a lot of people saying these
On a
days that
short list.
Babe Ruth couldn't play baseball these days. Mickey Mantle, would have 250 strikeouts these days. Uh, nobody's smack talking Willie Mays, but Willie Mays had two things going against him. Obviously, there was a a racial bias, but there's also the fact that midway through his career, the team pulled the stakes up and moved to San Francisco. If Willie Mays had played in Polo Grounds his entire career, he would have broken Babe Ruth's record, no
Well,
doubt, right?
he played in a couple stadiums that were not easy to hit in.
Well, I mean, the short porches at the Polo Grounds weren't, they were not, they were, if you're a dead center
Center
hitter,
field was a
different
shot.
story. Yeah, but that means more triples and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But Candlestick Park sucked, especially back when they started. It wasn't enclosed, all that stuff. And you're moving, for some reason, LA, the Dodgers were able to capture LA, probably because they won so much when they moved there. But Willie kind of, on a national level, just kind of disappeared. Right, the best player, of the '50s and '60s, he probably wasn't the best player of the '50s or the '60s, but those 2 decades combined, he was. I would say Mantle had a better '50s than Mays, and I would say McCovey may have had a better '60s than Mays. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's off the top of my head. That's what I'm going for.
The rest of my night is now ruined.
Baseball reference. Enjoy.
It'll be a baseball reference tonight. You might get a text or 100. We'll see.
Yeah.
So, guy, I want to throw a couple people that I think are hobby undervalued. And part of it is I look at how many cards are made, and obviously the hobby doesn't like them, or they would make more cards.
Can I raise my hand as I do on Zoom calls often?
Yeah.
I'm just going to say I do not subscribe to undervalued, underrated, any of that nonsense, because I always say everybody's rated properly.
Do you
Card
think
wise, valued? I mean, because
well,
the market has set itself forever, and we are just following along. We can't create a market for Al Kaline all of a sudden. Great baseball player, great Baltimorean, Baltimorean, but we can't suddenly create a market for Al Kaline and undiscovered. He's underappreciated because he didn't play in a media hub like New York.
So you just hit on two things first of all, the city and the media hub, I think helps answer part of the Stan Musial question, because it was not New York, and back then St. Louis was
It was the West Coast.
It was
of
the
baseball.
West Coast, and baseball was very Northeast centric, and the newspapers and the coverage and everything else. And then you just made the other point, which is we can't make Al Kaline have a market, but can we educate people to appreciate players more? Like Yogi Berra was a hell of a player.
Right.
Okay. There's almost no market. There's almost no love.
I disagree with you there.
Compared to his contemporaries. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah. Well, the modern day.
Like, well, even guys of his time. I mean,
it's Campanella, right? And him. You're talking about positional, or talking about?
I'm talking about all positions. I think he's the Bill Russell. I call him the Bill Russell of baseball. What does he have? 11 rings, 10 or something like that.
I think Yogi's pretty. I think Yogi does very well in the hobby, and I will tell you that, and this is no lie, I've sold in the past couple months 20, and this is dead serious, 20 84 tops traded Yogi Berra manager cards. People buy Yogi Berra cards.
Did you see the documentary?
I watched about half of it so far, but like my mind has been made up on Yogi for most of my life, because I've known the history of Yogi.
I think if more people watch Ken Burns, let's say everybody in the hobby watched Ken Burns, would that change who they saw it after?
Ken Burns short armed the 70s. So if you're talking about the first X amount of innings, then so be it. But
I guess you're the wrong guy.
He's short armed the 70s. Yeah, Ken Burns. If Ken Burns were ever to meet me in an airport, be careful, buddy, because he's short armed the 70s. But everybody should watch the document. But that's part of what cards are about. And everyone who is deep into card collecting, who has great cards, to a person will tell you that they're always learning about players. And I would argue that the best player in Tigers history isn't who you think it is. Right. I would argue that. I mean, Cobb was great, but I would say Charlie Gehringer was probably the perfect Tiger.
Well, I mean,
He won
they've got quite a
championships. He
list.
did it
Yep.
quietly, right? He did it quietly and all that stuff. Not a lot of people collect Charlie Gehringer cards, you know.
But
So,
is it because of the lack of availability? Is it the price?
well, that's the thing, right? Again, boy, you really got me. You really teeing me up, and I appreciate it, Danny. But one of the greatest players of all time, and I recently had this discussion somewhere, uh, is Joe DiMaggio. When I was a kid, Joe DiMaggio was everything. But Joe DiMaggio is essentially forgotten today, and part of that is what is that?
That's
That's a
my
note.
list. The fewest amount of
Yeah,
cards. You're
because of
100%
yeah.
correct.
So think about Joe DiMaggio, like growing up between the Gaudy era, of the 33 and 34, the major Gaudy stuff, and pre-tops, right? And there's sporadic stuff in there, play ball and leaf and stuff like that. Never
Yep.
appeared on the tops during his playing days, all that. So it's very, he has kind of a small footprint in the hobby, right? I will tell you that I think Joe DiMaggio is a better baseball player than Mickey Mantle. But Mickey Mantle grew up and as an athlete in New York during the bubblegum card wars and the aftermath of that, and he was the king. I mean, there's no denying he's the king of the hobby, and he always will be, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, but why? He's not the if we both agree he's not the best player in
Think about these kids, like these generations of
but
fans that are
Derek
like
is
you.
Derek Jeter gonna be that for the next in 40
Derek
years?
Jeter sells a lot of cards, and Derek
Derek
Jeter
Jeter has
rises
had
above.
23,000 cards made. That welcome to
And
today's world.
I sell a good amount of Derek Jeter cards. I'm not saying I sell hundreds, but I sell dozens of them. Derek Jeter is an outlier in the fact that how many cards were produced in the 90s, right? He's in the same Hall of Fame that Dave Winfield's in, that Paul Molitor's in, that Greg Biggio's in, Jeff Bagwell. Nobody cares about those guys. It's a New York thing, Captain America, all that nonsense, right? You can't
So
help who people latch on to, man. People latch on like Mike Trout right now, snow cone Mike Trout.
yep.
People love Mike Trout, and he's going to be that torchbearer. All these other folks, would you rather have the career Mike Trout had if Mike Trout hung it up today, or would you rather have the career Miguel Cabrera had? I'd probably rather have the career Miguel Cabrera, triple crown, world champion, 3,000 hits, 500
That's a
home
great
runs.
question.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just like it does. Mike Trout, career wise, has had a great 10
Great
years,
career. You've got
but he's like there's guys like Pujols who were sort of collectible, but
well,
not like Mike Trout is collectible.
I'm trying to think. Is Trout, without the championships, does he become Dan Marino? Who's the comparison?
Dan
Um,
Marino set records, right? I mean, Dan
he,
Marino.
well, Trout's
Trout is great. Like
got a
Trout is
ton of
great, but
MVPs, and
Trout's also overlaps with Griffey, overlaps with Pujols, overlaps with Cabrera.
Griffey. I
Those
bet Griffey has the most cards of anybody. What do you think?
he's another outlier, right? With all those folks that he came up with, the Barry Larkins and all that stuff. Like you don't see a lot of Barry Larkin uh, people
Griffey's got
running
more
around.
than Jeter, Trout, Ripken, all of
Does
them.
he? Good.
Yep.
And talk about your boy there, Babe Ruth, right? Babe Ruth
Not,
is had
not a hobby
cards.
darling.
He had base set cards in the teens, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. He had a base card up until probably 1973 when it was him, Aaron, and Mays on a card. So there's another guy who
Ex-
endured and stuff like that.
But he's not loved in the hobby equivalent to his love on the field.
Yeah, but I've seen, and maybe I missed it the first however many years I was collecting, but like I don't remember in the 70s and the 80s like a big hullabaloo about the 33 Gaudy Ruths, but now it's it's attained that elite card stratosphere, whatever you want to put it in. It's cards that people. It's a lot of people's Grail cards, and there's four of them in that set, right? 33 Gaudy.
I call
So
it the Andy Warhol. So
yeah, Yeah, but I mean, it's like I don't recall that. The 52, I grew up with the 52 Mantle was a big card. The Wagner was a big card in the 80s.
Is it
33 Galley
because,
Roots I never heard of until I mean, I knew they were there, but it was like now,
but
Ruth
that was right after his
continues.
playing career. Does it matter that it's playing days versus non-playing days?
No, I mean, he was still playing back then, wasn't he?
I
33?
thought he retired right around there.
Okay,
30
maybe I'm wrong because he's
No,
depicted as a
32 is the
Yankee.
called ho 32 is the called home run. You're right. He should have been
Yeah.
playing in 33.
But I mean, it has little to do with that. Again, maybe it's a New York thing, but he was on all, he continued to be on cards. He's in the 48 leaf, right? He's in
Right,
the
which is
the
obviously
look
after.
and see. He's in a tops look and see card in 52. He's got his own subset in 62 tops, right? So it's like he never kind of went away.
But
Uh,
all time, even with the modern inserts, and to your point, a lot of these are recent. He's got less cards made than Mantle,
right.
and
Mantle's
half
had
of
whole
them.
sets done. Tops
Yeah,
loves Mantle.
Ruth and Bonds are
Upper
about
deck love
equal
Mantle. Who's that? Ruth and Bonds.
in
Bonds is a great player, man.
cards
You
made.
know. Yeah. But it's weird, and they're opposite sides of the spectrum. One was very gregarious, and one was very standoffish. Yet, I guess that's why people would rather have a Ruth card. I know, steroids aside and all that stuff. Look, Bill Belichick is considered the greatest coach of all time. Tom Brady's greatest quarterback of all time. These guys got caught cheating a couple times, right?
Right.
Like, but anyway,
Well,
uh,
but will Bonds be? I'm saying, in 30 years, when two other guys are having this conversation, is
there's
Mickey
too many
Mantle
cards.
is
There's too
Mantle
many
still going to
cards.
be the guy?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I shouldn't. He's not going to be the only guy, but think about like part of the, and I think you touched on it earlier. Part of it is the proliferation of cards, right? If Tops or Fanatics or Donruss or Upper Deck is releasing hundreds of Mickey Mantle cards a year,
Yep.
different cards, and it's watering that product down. It doesn't water down his playing day stuff at all because that stuff is still pretty hot, if you ask me. That'll never go away. But again, we talk about manufactured or contrived scarcity or whatever. You're just that's oversaturating the modern day market. But the other cards are. I don't see anybody saying, "Oh, they just pumped out another dozen Mickey Mantles Fanatics, so that's going to affect his 62 top price." It won't. Those cards they've 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 cemented their place in history.
Well, I think there's a difference, and I think you said you disagree, but I think there's a difference in playing day cards that people like better than the non-playing days.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure. Yeah.
yeah, okay.
Did I say otherwise?
Well,
I
maybe I
apologize.
misunderstood.
Not
Maybe I
you can't
misunderstood.
touch the playing days because you can continue to improve or make non-playing day cards, but you can't. And and Ruth is the difference in that because they kept putting Ruth cards out because he was so popular decade to decade to decade. But
So
it still doesn't approach what they're doing. His stuff up until 1973 pales in comparison to the stuff that's been made from 1990 on of Ruth.
so if Topps had sets throughout his playing career, would his cards be worth more money?
You talking about if tops were manufacturing in the 30s?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I always found it interesting that the 20s are kind of underrepresented in cards because it was like really it was the Gilded Age and all that stuff, right? It was
It was strip cards. A lot of it was.
yeah, but it's strange because there was a lot of tobacco cards from the
Mhm.
teens and the late aughts, but the 20s seem a little bit less represented, and it was a pretty good time economically up until the whatever 27 or whatever it was a pretty high flying time. So I'm always surprised that there aren't more Ruth playing days cards.
And I think that affects the value of his stuff. So, getting back to the original question of why are some players looked at or collected differently? Um, Now that we've had this conversation, from usual, I think it's a lack of cards produced in his lifetime. Um,
In his
There was
lifetime or in his playing career? Because there's a lot
well,
of
his
them out
playing
there.
career, but definitely in the immediate aftermath also.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, he's still, the people
like
that
he's
know, the
yeah.
people that know still go after his cards pretty heavily, but there aren't a lot of them. And my point being is you can like retrospectively appreciate a player, but like Mantle, you know, he got these people in real time. He got these kids hooked in real time. There was no research that had to be done. Mantle was there, right place at the right time, and that was passed down from generation to generation. The kids who grew up in the '50s and '60s. You know, my dad's favorite player was Mickey Mantle. Kids my age would say my dad's favorite player was Mickey Mantle, right? And that gets handed down. So there's, if you're exposed to it your entire life, going down to the basement, all you see is Mickey Mantle stuff, then that perpetuates that. But you know, it's like fantasy football. I always say fantasy football is a perfect promotional platform. Mickey Mantle, right place, right time.
See,
Right talent, right place, right time.
and I think Ken Griffey Jr. is the same thing. The more we have
Yeah, but
a conversation, the more I think that the market won't matter in the future as much in the future because of the multimedia aspect. And he played in the TV era.
sure. And there were so many collectors from the era that he came up in. Right, there were so many people that came of age in '89 and '90, and so on. But Ken Griffey Jr. If you ask if you go on a trade show floor, you're going to find more people talking about Mike Trout than Ken Griffey Jr. Right? Already and you'd think it'd be a captive audience if what you're saying is true. Ken Griffey Jr. is the man for a generation. All anybody's talking about is Shohei and
Well,
Trout.
they're 20-25 years apart in when they played.
Sure, right? Yeah,
You
but
know,
I mean, nobody talks about Pujols or Cabrera. I'm sorry I keep beating that drum, but
yeah.
it was just this. Maybe it was a spike in collector
The,
interest,
I
and that
believe you're
stuck.
doing.
That bug stuck.
Are you doing a pump and dump on Cabrera? Do you have
I'd like to buy more because I mean I appreciate and somebody will say, oh he had a lot of bad years, whatever, but like 500, 3,000 doesn't lie, Triple Crown doesn't lie, right?
the
I
last the
think
last
that,
couple of years were ceremonial at bats?
well, Pujols had 10 years of that, compared to his first
Yeah.
10 years. You want to talk about the Griffey years in Chicago with the White Sox?
No, but I will say
There's a lot.
That Bo Jackson might end up being one of the most loved players. Also,
Yeah, well, yeah, for sure, right? And you know what? You still have to explain Bo Jackson to people, man. I've had that. Like, oh, I don't get the Bo Jackson
that
thing.
is a
If you saw
shame.
that in real time, dude, if you saw Bo Jackson in real time, what he did to sports, you know, and people were already forgetting about Jordan, right? With LeBron James out there setting all sorts of, uh, you know, cumulative records, right?
So, is it
It's
current popularity, or do we have to wait 20 years to make a proper assessment? Because I think we have to wait. I don't think you can go by what's hot today. You know,
yeah, I always say that, man. Nolan Ryan's rookie card, when did that become hot? It wasn't 1968,
no,
man.
it's
It
the
was
last
more
10
like
years.
1988. I mean, people started, it was 20 years into his career, people started paying attention to Nolan Ryan cards,
Yeah, I
you
mean, it
know?
might. Well, I don't want to insult a friend of ours, but on the overrated list, I might put him. Um,
Well, I mean,
I'm officially gone, aren't I? Now
I'd
I'm
say he's,
officially
I
gone.
guess, I'd say he's properly rated. I'm because of the combination of what he did plus the Griffey effect that you refer to. So many people coming up in the hobby when this
Yeah.
guy was passing 5,000 strikeouts, 300 wins, 7 no hitters. That was a pretty big deal, right? And you know, he's properly rated. Now, you don't put him ahead of other guys. I don't think you put him ahead of Tom Seaver. I don't think you put him ahead of other guys of his era. Carlton,
Carlton, no.
I have you don't put him ahead of those guys, but he's properly rated. There's a lot of people that say that Nolan Ryan's underrated, which I think is uh, Absolutely crazy.
Yes.
Perfectly rated. In a
All
hobby,
right.
different story though, right? Because they made a
Well,
million
that
Nolan Ryan. How many Nolan Ryan cards do they make?
and I'll look that up right now. But outside of his rookie card, how many of them have any value?
They do. They hold value for sure. Especially the greatest stuff, 70, 71, 72, for sure. And part of that has to do with uh,
20,000, a huge number.
now compare that to Johnny Bench, who debuted the same year.
A catcher. It's not even
Well, it
fair.
doesn't matter. Johnny Bench was the best when Nolan Ryan was still trying to figure out which way home plate was. Right.
Half as many, 10,000.
Right. Same year debut, all that stuff. Right.
Yep.
Johnny Bench is by still considered by some to be the greatest catcher of all time.
And Johnny Bench is definitely a small hall guy, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you
But
can't
does he
say
get the
Nolan
hobby
doesn't.
love? Who gets
He
more
do, he
hobby
does.
love?
He's like one of those. It's like Steely Dan, man. Like I guess the hip people get it, right? The hip people get Johnny Bench. Meanwhile,
If Steely
the,
Dan is the answer, I want to know the question.
meanwhile, I have to explain to people why Bill Freehan was a good catcher because versus Joe Mauer. Joe Mauer was a great hitter. Bill Freehan
Joe
played in
Mauer
an
is not a
era
Hall of
where,
Famer.
well, don't tell that to the guy I argued with on Twitter. Bill Freehan was the best catcher in an entire league for uh, 11 years or 12 years. He missed the All Star, whatever he had, 11 out of 12 years or 12 out of 13. In one year, he didn't make the All Star team. He batted 290, which is insane. Back then, catchers were defensive.
How about Elston Howard on underappreciated? We'll use underappreciated.
He's not in a hall, right?
Well, does that make my case more or less?
Howard's weird. Like if you look at his baseball reference, like you'll see that like we all think of him, or at least you would think of him as a catcher, but look at his positioning. He played almost as many games in outfield, I would imagine, than he did as a catcher, which is strange. Because
He's
when
an
Yogi was catching, he was playing outfield. And then,
he's, he's another Mauer.
well, Maurer did, I don't know
Mauer
Maurer
only
well enough.
played half his games at catcher.
Yeah, I think he had like 900 career games as a catcher and 600 and something at first base and 300 and something as DH or something. But Howard was weird. Like I was when I found that out, however many years ago, that I just assumed he was a catcher his whole career, but it's
Yeah,
not the case. Are you going to give us some breaking news
um,
here in a second?
yeah. I am. I'm looking at his numbers. He's underappreciated.
Okay, but in a hobby,
In the hobby, I think he has no love. I bet most people
eh,
couldn't tell you who he was.
yeah.
When
Well,
was the
what's
last
weird
time you
about
could find
that?
a part of him?
Again, it's something we avoid, I think, talking about. But racism or racial bias has something
Please
to do
talk
with it,
about it.
right?
Yeah.
And then, especially in that era, the 50s and the 60s. Plus, how much room in your heart would an average New York Yankees fan have for after Mickey, after Yogi, after Whitey Ford, and then Maris comes around? Like, you don't have a lot of room left to love Bill Skowron and Elston Howard and Tom Tresh and all those guys. So
Well, they finally got around to Phil Rizzuto and
Phil
um,
Rizzuto deserves to be revoked, in my opinion, because I think a lot of Phil Rizzuto's biggest advantage to getting in the Hall was that he stayed in the game for so long, right? Which
well, it's
may
because
get Bill
he
White
was
in.
loved as a broadcaster.
Right. He was a, you know,
Yeah,
yeah.
the pitch. He was the pitch man for what? The Money Store, was that it?
Phil Rizzuto for the Money Store. And
Yeah.
yeah, and here's one for you. You can talk about people that don't might not get appreciated enough, either in the hobby or real world. Who's the best pitcher of the '50s? Do you think?
Are you gonna tell me Robin Roberts?
I'm going to tell you, Robin Roberts. Right? I mean, you'd have to agree with that, right? He was. I mean, he had a
Is
bigger
that really who
decade.
you were gonna say?
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure.
I'm
And
done.
like,
I'm done.
yeah, and he's got one of the most beautiful cards that people
Yes.
don't recognize, the 50 Bowman, right? And
Yep.
you know,
And Jim.
Philadelphia was no Philadelphia is 100 miles away from New York City, and they still weren't getting, that wasn't close enough to New York City to get him the publicity that he probably deserved during his a great 10 years that he had.
Well, and maybe we'll wrap this up. I think the common thread, I guess for appreciation is the market they played in, you know, how much exposure, which ties in with the market, and did they have cards available that people could buy?
Right.
You
Yeah.
know, tho
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that
For
seems
sure.
to be the trifecta. If you had all 3 of those, you seem to get more hobby love.
Yeah, it's like a seed that gets planted. Like I said, that's why I think Mantle. One thing we forgot to mention was the baby boomers, right? The post-war kids.
Yep.
Think about a 7-year-old who's was born in 45, and he's going to go for Mickey Mantle, right?
Right, but who's buying the cards now? And who are they? And that's where I make the Griffey argument.
Yeah, yeah, but I mean, what Griffey card are you going to fawn over 30 years from now, other than the '89 Upper Deck, which they're still making them by all. I think we all know they're still making them, or at least that's what we perceive to be happening. Like, what card are you going to go after?
It
You
would
had
have to it would have to be some random, how many cards did I say he had? He's got, some crazy number, like 27,000 or something. It would be some random 101, patch auto something that I would find
sure
cool.
that's not that card was made to be rare, right?
That's the
The
false scarcity, and
the
that's
the red the
yeah.
red heart Mickey Mantle was not made to be rare. In fact, it was for
Well,
its
you're talking
time.
are you talking dog food?
I'm talking dog food, which,
S
by the way,
Yeah.
back then had way too much calcium. Dog food, so I'm glad they
And
rectified.
remember to get your pet spayed and neutered.
And we're getting fancy. For 10 cents a month, you can whatever Sarah McLachlan says. Uh, just keep in mind that that was a card that they kept sending out to people for a decade or more. Yet it's a coveted card now, right? Uh, i- and it wasn't made as a 101 or an auto or whatever.
Well, you can't
People are
do
going after that.
regional releases or advertising releases like that anymore.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I mean, that's the
Well,
shame
trust
of
me,
it.
that's a thorn in my side because that's how you get kids to be hobbyists instead of
Well, that's
collectors.
where the false scarcity comes in,
Yeah, put it
that's
in
where
every aisle. Yeah, yeah, but I mean, it's like you can't Griffey, contrived value of cards doesn't compare to cards that were just organically made. I'm not talking about the dog food. I'm talking about the dog food cards where they were just
yeah,
they weren't made to be valued. They were made to
sell
collect,
dog food.
right?
Well, they were
Yeah,
made
sell
to sell
dog food,
dog food.
promote. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So I mean, that's what that you can never compare those. You can't be an error appropriator because I should say era, the eras are the eras, and they have to be taken in the context of the eras, right? And we
right.
can't compare Mantle in the '50s to Griffey in the '90s. It's just apples and oranges.
Sure we can. We can do whatever we want.
Okay, copy
Alright.
that.
On that note, I think we've, gone into overtime, so I'm gonna
And
say
thanks
thank you.
everybody for agreeing with me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And I
Good luck.
appreciate doing these live shows with the live openings. I'm on a roll with you. So
Just play
uh,
it at the end sometime, man. Right? Just
we
play
should
it.
just put it in the middle. Take a halftime. All right.
Sounds good.
Good seeing you, buddy. Happy Thanksgiving and holidays to everybody.
When does Hanukkah start? Do we know?
It's early this year. It's the beginning of December. All I know is
All
I've
right.
already gotten my kids' presents, so I'm done.
L- let's rock Hanukkah, everybody. Be kind to each other. Do spade, and there's a lot of people that need to be spayed and neutered as well. But let's
Okay.
start with the dogs and the cats. Then we'll get around to the people. I have a list. Um, yeah,
I think we'll leave it at that. See you guys.
copy. See you guys, gals.